Okay, everybody, we've come out to the field. Today we're at Delgado Community College. We're here behind the greenhouse in the orchard area where the master gardeners have been doing a really nice job of rejuvenating this area. So Dr. Joe, Anna, and I have all brought some things from our kitchens or in our house, and we're going to show you what, actually we're going to kind of go through our trash, which is funny, but we're going to show you some things that we're going to compost that we would compost at our homes. So you can see I've got a nice collection of browns here on the right. I've got a tube that came out of, it was some cellophane wrap actually, so that's compostable. I've got my copy of the Gambit magazine. If you're from New Orleans, you're very familiar with the Gambit magazine. I've already shredded most of it, so that's ready to go in the compost pile. I've got some packaging, some cereal boxes here, things like that, anything cardboard of that nature. A banana peel, some lettuce and cabbage leaves that came from dinner I made the other day. This was an unfortunate attempt at some toast this morning. You can see I got it nice and crispy. Some old sweet potatoes. Here's a watermelon rind, already chopped up. Coffee grounds, some eggs, eggshells rather. And I've got some leaves over here. It's a good example. I've got both leaves that have been just raked up, and then I have some leaves that I chopped up with a lawnmower. So I've got the shredded ones and regular ones. It's best if I shred these up, but we're gonna go ahead and put them in there anyway. And I've also got a pair of old jeans here. Unfortunately, the backside kind of gave out on these, but these are 100% cotton except for the zipper and the snaps and the little studs. So I'm gonna chop these up and throw them in there. So that's what I brought. So let's take a look at Anna's stuff and see what she's got.
Hey everyone. So Chris just showed you what he brought from his house, and what I brought from my house is probably something that a few of you will have access to. This is manure from my chickens that I keep in my backyard, and I have some rabbit manure mixed in there as well. I feed my rabbits this grass hay, so there's a lot of that in it as well. As they're eating it, they waste a lot of it, but all of that is compostable. There's even some feathers in here from my chickens, which of course are also compostable. So this is all a really good material to add to our compost bin.
I'm sorry, would you say that's a green or a brown?
It's both. So the actual manure component, the poultry and rabbit manure, is considered green. It's very rich in nitrogen. And then all the stuff like the feathers and the straw, the hay, that would be considered a brown. So this is actually a mixture of both.
Okay, now I brought a bunch of stuff from home. Some of it's compostable, some of it isn't. And so I'm going to kind of talk to you a little bit about that. What you would want to use in your compost pile, what you wouldn't, maybe some reasons why, and the difference between a cold compost pile and a hot compost pile. Because some of the things I have here will go into a hot compost pile, but I would not want to put it in my cold compost pile. So one of the things which we mentioned to you that you might not want to put in your compost pile, or that you might want to, it's an iffy thing, are eggshells. Now, eggshells really are great in a compost pile. But if you use eggshells that still have the raw egg material on them, they're going to attract pests, they might start to smell. And so what I do with mine is during the cooking process, just toss them into a bowl of water, let them sit there while you're doing the rest of the cooking. And then put them onto a toaster oven rack, put them in the toaster oven, put it on toast for 30 seconds to a minute or so. And what that does, it dries out the shells and it kills any of the foul smelling bacteria that might be on them. And so now I got the eggshells ready for the compost pile. But what you don't want to do is throw the compost pile full of eggs that are like this. Because if you put an eggshell in that looks like this, 2 or 3 months later when you think your compost pile is finished, it's still going to have eggshells in it like this. So what you want to do for your compost pile is, once you've got them clean and dried, as Chris mentioned, particle size is everything. So now, put these in the compost pile. And when the compost pile is finished, you won't see these anymore. They add a lot of calcium to your compost pile. They are really good to go into compost pile, but you want to make sure you do it the right way. So now I got eggshells for the compost pile. Same as Chris, I brought some coffee grounds. Now we've had some questions on coffee grounds. People say, coffee grounds are good fertilizer for your garden. Other people say they're terrible because they're going to cause the pH of the garden to get really low because coffee is acidic. Well, the truth of the matter is these are used coffee grounds. And once coffee grounds have been used, the acids have been washed away. They're essentially rinsed coffee grounds, if you want to think of it that way. So, coffee grounds, they're not green, but they count as a green because their carbon-nitrogen ratio is about 25:1. Got the filter in there. So coffee grounds are great for your compost pile. Now, if you put them in the garden just like they are, they're not going to hurt your plants, but they still got to break down in order for the nutrients to become available to the plant. So why not put them in the compost pile? They'll get composted much more quickly. The nutrients will be available for your plant. So coffee grounds are great for your garden, especially if you compost them. So don't worry about using coffee grounds. It's not going to mess up the pH of your garden. Another thing, Chris I know has mentioned several times about junk mail. Anna too. You get junk mail, you want to throw it in your compost pile. Well, you can take it and do this to it, which works. Or you just have this little, little shredder like this. It's great for, as Chris mentioned once before, if you got bills or something like that, you don't want to throw those in there whole because they might not, you don't want your neighbors going through there and finding out, how much you're paying for your internet. But having a shredder like this, that way you can just have it sitting near the door, feed the junk mail through, makes nice small pieces. These are great for the compost pile. These also make great bedding for vermicomposting, which we're going to talk about in a later module. So this is a great little tool to have. They're not very expensive, and it makes better sizes than this. And when you have one like this, now you got this plastic here on them. That's really hard to get off, and it's not going to degrade when you compost it. Now if you tear it up, you're going to have big pieces. If you run it through this first, even those small pieces aren't going to really be much of a nuisance. So this is a nice little thing to have. Newspaper. Anyone's ever done this with newspaper, you know what I'm talking about. Newspaper, you try to tear it this way. Now, it doesn't tear very evenly, but if you want to make shredded newspaper, doing it this way, long ways, something about the way they put those cellulose fibers together, it's real easy to shred newspaper. Once again, newspaper makes great bedding for your worms, and it's great material for your compost pile. So definitely want to use newspaper. That's really good brown material. Now, woody material. I got two examples of woody material here. Got some old twigs, and I got some pieces of wood. Now, this I would put in the compost pile, this I wouldn't. Why? Well, these are big pieces, not a lot of surface area, and so it's going to take these a long time to break down. Now, if you screen your compost before you use it, you'll put these in your compost pile. Your first pile finishes, you screen it out, you're still going to have these. Do it again, still going to have these. Do it again, still going to have these. But now twigs are easy to break up, make into small pieces. You can do it with your hands, you can do it with pruners. These are great for your compost pile. Pine needles. These can also be composted. Some people worry about pine needles causing a pH problem in their compost pile. Well, there are some resinous materials in pine needles, so you don't want to have a compost pile that is primarily pine needles. But mixing pine needles in your compost pile, don't go overboard, and you're perfectly fine. You don't have to worry about the resins that are in there, no problem. In our area, Spanish moss, another good material to put in your compost pile. It's already shredded, a lot of surface area. Wrapping from packages, nylon, artificial material, not for the compost pile. Now here I have two pair of old gloves, a pair of leather ones, a pair of cotton ones. These are just like Chris's jeans he talked about. Now these, I can put these in the compost pile. I'd cut them up, shred them, do something to them to make them smaller. These can go in the compost pile. These, it's a natural material. It'll break down. But you know how long it takes leather to degrade in a compost pile? 50 years or more. So, my old leather gloves, those don't go in the compost pile. Now here I have a mixture of materials from the kitchen. This is all organic matter. I would chop this up like Chris did with his French chef knife. Great material for your compost pile. Here I have the seeds out of this spaghetti squash. Now, if I'm doing a hot compost pile, I would put these in it because the heat during the thermophilic phase is going to kill all these seeds. They're not going to germinate. Now, unless you want to grow a compost pile that's full of spaghetti squash vines, you wouldn't put these in your cold compost pile because definitely they're going to sprout and they're going to grow. Same thing with this potato. I mean, it's an old potato, kind of shriveled up, not very appetizing. A lot of people will just chop this up and throw it in a compost pile. If I'm doing hot compost, I would put it in there. In a cold compost pile, all these eyes, you're taking a chance of creating a potato crop if you put this in your cold compost pile. You can do it, it's all right, but just be aware you might be growing potatoes. Now this is a rotting bell pepper. Now if I pick this off of a bell pepper plant and it's in this shape, I don't know what's causing that disease. Could be bacterial, could be fungal, whatever. If it looks like this when I pick it, it's diseased material. This I would put in a hot compost pile. Plus it's got seeds in there. I would not put this in my cold compost pile because if there's disease organisms in there, in a cold compost pile, they'll survive. And then when I put it in my garden next year, I'm going to be spreading that disease around. Citrus, we already talked about that. Citrus takes a long time to break down. Now in a hot compost pile, I might chop this up into very fine pieces and I go ahead and put this in my hot compost pile. In the cold compost pile, there's not as many organisms in there, especially during the thermophilic phase, to break down the materials in citrus that is not good. So I would put these chopped up in my hot compost pile, not in my cold compost pile. But remember, it's going to take a long time for citrus to break down. One final thing I have here is a dog food bag. Now you think, okay, paper tears easily. That'd probably be good for a compost pile. But if you take a close look, any material like this has a real shiny surface. Especially you think dog food, they don't want it to get wet. So this material has been treated to keep water out. Well, that also means it's probably some type of plastic or waxy material. It's not going to break down in a compost pile. So this will go in my garbage or in my recycling bin, but it wouldn't go in my compost pile because it's not going to break down. Cardboard is another one, and Chris mentioned this earlier. Now, here I have a dry piece of cardboard. I can tear it up in chunks. And that would go good in a compost pile. But, you look at the difference between that one and this one. This one was on the inside. And this one I wet. So what I've done now is I've taken dry brown material. I've added the moisture that the compost pile needs for the microorganisms, and it's a whole lot easier to tear up into small pieces. An easy way to do that is, if you're going to put cardboard in the compost pile, leave it outside and let it rain on it for a couple of days. It breaks down and tears up real easily. Now we have these labels and tape on the outside of boxes a lot of times. Now Chris mentioned this, this can go in the compost pile. You just might, fish these out later, but these are nylon threads. It depends on the person, how they want to do it. Me, I pull the tape off before it goes in the compost pile. Why? Because I just don't want to deal with those nylon threads later on. Chris, he's different. You're different. Everybody's different. Do it the way you want to do it. Just remember though, those nylon threads will not break down in a compost pile. So they're going to be in there whenever you got your finished product to work with. Of course, there's grass clippings. These are great green materials for your compost pile. Have a lot of nitrogen. They're already got the moisture. These work great. Cotton balls, cotton's a natural material, just like these gloves. Good for a compost pile. Finally, I brought these as a demonstration. When we talked about carbon nitrogen ratios, 25 to 1, 35 to 1 being an ideal one. You can measure how much carbon you have divided by how much nitrogen you have so that you know you have the right carbon nitrogen ratio, or following the rule of thumb, 2 to 3 browns for every 1 green. Anything you got, you can measure, because it's a volume that we're talking about, not weight. So I can take brown materials, fill this up with brown materials, and that would be 1 measure of browns. And then I come back, add green materials, fill this up. I got 1 measure of greens. So now I got 1 to 1. So I need 1 more measure of brown material. Load it up with sticks, with cardboard, with leaves. So now I've got my 2 to 1 ratio of browns to greens. All we want to do is measure the volume. So now we're going to go over and put all this into one of those composting units that we talked about and start our own composting bin.
And our pile is finished. So we've layered it, we've watered it, and now we're just going to keep an eye on it and come in and take daily temperatures to follow its progress.